Ladies and gentlemen, they actually just got a verdict to this story, and it's not something I would typically talk about when it comes to Harvey Weinstein and this Ghislaine Maxwell person that you see on my screen, this decrepit looking individual right here. But the reason why this is important because it actually did involve minors. Now, of course, we can't put those pictures out there or anything, but we can't talk about this story. And this story is going to have a few details in it. So that's your disclaimer. But this comes out of New York, and I thank CNN for this news story. But a jury in New York federal court has found Ghislaine Maxwell, I almost called her Ghislaine, but whatever. Ghislaine Maxwell guilty on 5 of 6 counts. Almost all of them. 5 of 6 counts related to her role in the Jeffrey Epstein sexual abuse of minor girls between 1994 and 2004. Jeffrey Epstein. I don't know whose name I said earlier, but Jeffrey Epstein, this situation. Maxwell, who was 60 years old, was found guilty of 5 charges, 5 federal charges. That's federal time. Sex trafficking of a minor, transporting a minor with intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and 3 related counts of conspiracy. Children. She gave up children. If you ask me, these are the worst type of people that there are. Anybody who would hurt, murder, and abuse our children, sexually traffic our children. This black market is a really big business that's propagated by a lot of people, and you're looking at people on my screen who were doing this type of thing. She was acquitted on the charge of enticing a minor to travel to engage in in illegal sexual acts. Maxwell, who now faces 65 years in prison, if you ask me, I think she deserves every bit of it. 65 years in prison, showed no reaction when the verdicts were read. Stone cold faced. Judge Allison Nathan did not set a sentencing date. The road to justice has been far too long, but today justice has been done, according to the U.S. Attorney Damian Williams said in a statement. I want to commend the bravery of the girls, now grown women, who stepped out of the shadows and into the courtroom. And I want y'all to remember that they were children when this was forced onto them. Their courage and willingness to face their abuser made this case and today's result possible. The jury, which was made up of 6 women and 6 men, deliberated about 40 hours across parts of 6 days. Prosecutors argued Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein conspired to set up a scheme to lure young girls into sexual relationships with Epstein from 1994 to 2004 in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the Virgin Islands. So this man and this woman had a lot of money at their disposal, and this really drew out their character to show who they really, really were, who were just horrible individuals. Florida, New Mexico, New York, and the Virgin Islands. 4 women testified during the trial that Jeffrey Epstein abused them and that Maxwell facilitated the abuse and sometimes participated in it as well. And it makes you wonder where the parents were. I always question that, and I never really will feel sorry because they didn't kidnap these kids. They were coerced. Where were their parents at? All these kids, where are the parents? I will always question that. Her defense, meanwhile, said she was a scapegoat for Epstein's actions and attacked the memories and motivations of the women who say that they were sexually abused. Maxwell's lawyers are working on an appeal, attorney Bobby C. Sternheim said. We firmly believe in Ghislaine's innocence. Obviously, we were disappointed in the verdict. Adding, her team believes Maxwell still will be vindicated. The trial, which began November 29th, alternated between disturbing testimony from sexual abuse victims and illuminating testimony about some of Epstein's connections to high-profile celebrities. Annie Farmer, one of the four accusers who testified, said Wednesday she hopes the verdict brings solace to the victims. I'm so relieved and grateful that the jury recognized the pattern of predatory behavior that Maxwell engaged in for years and found her guilty of these crimes. She has caused hurt to many more women than the few of us who had a chance to testify in the courtroom. Epstein, who pled guilty in 2008 to state prostitution charges, was indicted on federal sex trafficking charges in 2019 of July, but died by suicide in prison a month later. Maxwell, his confidant and former girlfriend, was arrested a year afterward and has been in jail since then. It remains to be seen whether others will be prosecuted, which I hope they will. Anybody who participated, I hope they will as well. CNN legal analyst Ellie Honig, a former prosecutor in the district where Maxwell was tried, said that this was not a two-person operation, and I agree. He pointed to civil lawsuits that link others to abuse. I think prosecutors have a real obligation to dig all the way down to the bottom and bring anyone else who may have been a part of this to justice. Maxwell also faces 2 pending perjury charges related to a 2016 civil deposition. Now, let me go ahead and give you guys the fair usage. I can read you a little bit more, but I'm going to skip some of this because it's a little bit long. But let me give you guys the fair usage and let me play the 2 news videos that we have. Let's get it. Federal law allows citizens to reproduce, distribute, or exhibit portions of copyrighted motion pictures, videotapes, or video discs under certain circumstances without the authorization of the copyright holder. This is called fair use. It is allowed for purposes of criticism, news reporting, teaching, and parody, which doesn't infringe of copyright under 17 U.S.C. 107. And if you guys are listening to this, you can always help us by making sure for everybody that's watching, let's get 1 thumb up for everybody watching. Hit that thumbs up, okay? Let's get it.
Do we have Ron? Do we have the verdict? So I'm going to read this to you, Joyce. She was found guilty on 5 counts, not guilty on 1. I believe it's count 1, guilty, 3, 4, 5, and 6, not guilty on count 2. Does that surprise you based on what you know about the evidence and how long this jury deliberated?
So with your permission, Nicole, I'll take a look at my little cheat sheet on the indictment, which tells me that count 2 was the enticement of victim 1 to travel. And there had been some suggestion that this case in large part would turn on whether the jurors believed the victims. The defense tried to paint them out as people who had been willing participants and who were essentially participating in this case in an effort to make money or bring attention to themselves. But it seems clear that the jury rejected that because they convicted, according to what we're hearing, on the conspiracy count involving that victim, as well on the other counts. This is an enormous victory for the government, but far more importantly than that, this is a verdict that signifies that girls who are trafficked, girls who are groomed, girls who are criminally subjected to sex in this sort of manner can achieve vindication in court, that jurors will listen to their stories, and that more people who have been subjected to trafficking should feel confident that if they report what has happened to them to law enforcement, that they will be taken seriously and that their concerns will be heard.
So Ghislaine Maxwell, the breaking news, has been found guilty on 5 of the 6 charges she faced. They include conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors here they are. Count 3, conspiracy to transport a minor with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity.
Do y'all agree with me? What do y'all think? I think the parents ought to be under investigation and locked up as well. I think this is bigger than just the people who were facilitating this. I think the parents really should be looked at for neglect or something. I don't really know what you would charge the parents with, but I think they need to look at it, though.
Transporting a minor with the intent to engage in criminal sexual activity, and those 2 counts of perjury related to testimony in 2016, as well as conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors. Joyce, I wonder if you can speak to whether this has farther-reaching ramifications to sex trafficking prosecutions moving forward.
These are such difficult cases to bring for so many reasons. For a long time, prosecutors were required to rely on a law called the Mann Act. More recently, in the more serious counts of conviction that we see in this indictment, statutes that specifically apply to trafficking of minors were put in place to make it to give prosecutors, frankly, more tools to use to go after these sorts of criminals. And so what we can see is that the law here is responsive to the needs to protect people from predators and from traffickers. That there is the ability to reach back in time, because typically in a federal case, there's a 5-year statute of limitations. These charges, of course, are much older. And that's because Congress has abrogated that statute of limitations for crimes involving children and provided a much lengthier pullback that gives prosecutors the ability to charge these crimes after children who are victims come of age and are able to tell their stories and are more comfortable telling their stories. So this is certainly a victory in this individual case. This is some accountability for the victims in this case, but it also sends a larger message about the willingness of the Justice Department to take on sex trafficking, which can be a tough crime for state prosecutors to attack, because by its very nature, it often involves interstate travel, and that makes it difficult for a prosecutor in one state to go after all the aspects of these groups that are involved in it. It really requires federal involvement. These are difficult cases to bring. These prosecutors plowed through a lot of criticism early on in the case, where there was a lot of criticism of their early witnesses as being unprepared or not compelling. And so getting this verdict is a vindication for both these victims, but also for the larger work in this area of prosecuting trafficking.
You know, some of the victims courageously spoke out in a few interviews, and I wonder if you can speak to how a jury sort of perceives that testimony. Again, it was graphic, it was upsetting, it was painful. The Jeffrey Epstein, the sordid nature of his conduct and his abuse was something covered by journalists nationally and obviously locally for a long time. But talk about what these witnesses went through and how sort of re-traumatizing it likely was for them.
Because society stigmatizes people who have been victims of trafficking, just like victims in rape cases were stigmatized and still are to some extent for many years, these are some of the most difficult crimes for victims to take the stand and testify about. And a lot of the way the jury reacts, the tone is set by the judge. Judges are very aware of that, and judges do a really good job, in my view, in the overwhelming majority of these cases, of setting context for jurors about the evidence that they'll hear, about giving them a comfort level with handling it. But ultimately, it's up to the jurors themselves, and it's something that's very affirming about our system of justice, is to see a jury handling a difficult situation, evidence that can be very traumatic, victims who are all too often being re-traumatized when they're on the witness stand and subjected to both direct examination and also to cross-examination, and the ability of juries to review the evidence, to follow the instructions about the law in a dispassionate way in these very difficult situations is something that has always affirmed to me that our system of justice really does work. You know, we talk a lot about its imperfections and its failures and the fact that our system of justice is aspirational. But this is something that we should feel good about, that these really difficult sorts of cases can be decided and handled by juries. And these victims, who my heart just goes out to as a prosecutor, every time you put a witness on a stand to testify to these sorts of very difficult facts, you understood that it came at a great cost to them. And you often had just remarkable appreciation of the emotional toll it took on them and their families. But this need to find justice, to hold these particular defendants accountable, and to create sort of a generalized deterrence that prevents these crimes in the future as people become more aware of the likelihood of conviction and the lengthy sentences people involved in these crimes face. This is such an important accomplishment.
Next video.
Hi, everyone. I'm Phil Lipoff. We are coming on the air right now with breaking news. A verdict has been reached in the trial of Jeffrey Epstein's former confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell. Longtime Epstein associate is guilty of all but one charge she faced. Maxwell is not guilty of the one-count enticement, and that dealt with the victim who was just, or the alleged victim who was just called Jane in court. Take a look. There it is. The 6 counts she faced. She faced a total of 70 years in prison, and she was found guilty on 5 of the 6 counts, which she now faces 65 years in prison. This verdict just came down. I want to bring in ABC's Aaron Katersky, who joins us by phone. He was in the courtroom when this verdict came down, and also C.K. Hoffler, former president of the National Bar Association. C.K., stand by for 1 second. Aaron, this verdict just came down. I'm reading your notes from inside the courtroom. Tell us what it was like and what you heard.
Well, it all happened very fast. The jury took about 40 hours to deliberate this verdict, Phil, over the last 6 days. And tonight, Ghislaine Maxwell has been convicted of all but one charge that she faced. She once ran in the circles of presidents and princes. She turned 60 in jail Christmas Day, and now she is going to be headed off to prison potentially for the next 65 years. In all likelihood, she will face far less than that. No sentencing date was immediately set. It was impossible to read her expression because Ghislaine Maxwell, like everyone else in that courtroom, wore a mask. But she was with her attorneys. Her siblings, 2 sisters and a brother, were seated in the gallery behind her. This verdict was undoubtedly disappointing. The defense said it needed some time to get itself together before it decided on any kind of an appeal. They also revealed that she has not had her booster shot yet, and due to the rapid spread of the coronavirus, they wanted to get Ghislaine Maxwell boosted before they brought her back into court for any kind of sentencing.
Aaron, 40 hours of deliberation. You have been following this case as closely as anyone else. Over the course of the last 3 days, the jury had been asking questions, asking to have testimony read back, even today from the pilot of Jeffrey Epstein's plane. Tell us a bit about what they asked for and what that meant to you leading up to this verdict.
The jury was incredibly thorough. They asked for more than a third of the case. They asked for the transcripts of testimony by 13 of the witnesses, a third of the case. And so they went meticulously through all of the testimony of the accusers and then a number of the supporting characters, plus a couple of the witnesses called by the defense, including a defense expert who testified about the frailty of memory. That was part of the crux of the defense case, was that the whole case against Ghislaine Maxwell, the defense said, was based on made-up stories and the false memories of these accusers. But it appears the jury disagreed and believed the women who testified, including a woman, Jane, identified under a pseudonym, who said that she met Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein when she was 14 years old, beginning years of abuse.
Now, Aaron, you mentioned Jane. Count 2, which she was not found guilty on, is enticement of a minor to travel to engage in illegal sex acts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That deals with Jane, right?
It does. The first 4 counts only really dealt with Jane's testimony. And it appears, based on one of the questions that the jury asked, that the jurors were confused by the charge, by all the elements that the government needed to prove in order to find her guilty of enticing Jane to travel when she was under the age of 17 for the purpose of having her engage in illicit sexual activity with Jeffrey Epstein. The jury at one point asked for a definition of enticement, and the judge declined to give one beyond referring the jury back to her legal instructions that the jurors were given before they began deliberations. And it sounded to the defense like the jury was quite confused about that charge, and they asked for all sorts of clarifications. The judge didn't do it. And in the end, Ghislaine Maxwell was acquitted of count 2. But that was a relatively minor charge that exposed her to only 5 years in prison. The more significant counts she was convicted of.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking.
Thank y'all so much for listening to that story. But again, I always like to put the onus on the source. The source is the parents. If the parents hadn't allowed this, first of all, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell need to be done. I mean, just period. I would have liked to see Jeffrey Epstein go through the whole court proceeding. You know, there are some conspiracies that swirl around that, and a lot of people believe that he was actually going to put more involvement on people that were helping facilitate this, which personally I would have loved to have seen that. That way we can get all guilty parties that were involved and be held accountable. Now, like I said, I think parents played a big role in this, and, you know, it's really sad that these kids were put through this by adults that really should have been there to protect them, but definitely shouldn't even have been involved with children, you know, at all. But nonetheless, that's this story. But I thank you guys so much for listening, and I'm glad we'll at least get some justice here in this story. So thank you so much for listening with an open mind as well as an open heart. And from the AFC, we'd like to thank you guys, and guys, have a good day. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. All right. Thank you. Peace.